Tunnel rats of Cu Chi. By 1966, the tunnel network beneath Cu Chi province in South Vietnam had grown to more than 200 miles. The Viet Cong had built it over decades, carving chambers, hospitals, weapons caches, and command rooms deep into the red clay earth. American forces knew the tunnels existed. What they didn't fully understand was what waited inside them. Standard infantry soldiers were too large to move through the passages effectively. The military needed smaller men willing to enter alone, armed with a pistol and a flashlight. They were called tunnel rats. The assignment was voluntary, but the conditions were documented in detail by military investigators and veteran accounts. Soldiers crawled through tunnels that were sometimes less than 2 feet wide. Ventilation was almost non-existent. Temperatures inside reached well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility was near zero. The Viet Cong had prepared the tunnels specifically for intruders. Military records and after-action reports documented the methods. Trapdoors concealed drops into lower chambers. Tripwires were stretched across passage openings at throat height. Pits lined with sharpened stakes were covered with thin mats of vegetation. Venomous snakes, documented in multiple field reports, were deliberately placed in sealed chambers. Soldiers who tripped a wire or fell through a concealed floor had no room to maneuver and no way to call for immediate help. Casualty reports confirmed that multiple tunnel rats were killed during clearance operations throughout the war. The exact number who died inside the tunnels was never fully separated from broader combat statistics, but the Pentagon acknowledged the role and its dangers in official documentation. When soldiers did not return from a tunnel entrance, the standard response was to call for engineer support. In some cases, explosives were used to collapse the passages entirely. Punji stick patrol casualties. Throughout the Vietnam War, one of the most consistently documented hazards facing American ground troops was not artillery or ambush. It was the ground itself. The Viet Cong deployed Punji stick traps extensively across South Vietnam from the early 1960s onward. The design was straightforward. Pits were dug along known patrol routes, trail junctions, and approaches to villages. Sharpened bamboo stakes were driven into the floor of each pit at upward angles. The opening was then covered with a thin layer of vegetation, woven matting, or loose soil, making it indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. U.S. military field reports documented the traps in substantial detail. The stakes were typically fire-hardened to increase rigidity. Many were deliberately contaminated with human waste. Military medical records confirmed that wounds from Punji stakes carried a high rate of serious infection. In a number of documented cases, the infection proved fatal even when the initial wound had not been immediately life-threatening. Soldiers who fell into the pits often sustained puncture wounds to the legs and feet. In deeper pits, upper body injuries were also recorded. Patrols moved through dense vegetation, rice paddies, and jungle trails where visibility of the ground directly ahead was limited. Point men, the soldiers walking at the front of a patrol, bore the highest documented rate of Punji stick casualties. There was no reliable method of detection at walking pace. Metal detectors were ineffective against bamboo. The U.S. military formally recognized Punji stick injuries as combat wounds, eligible for the Purple Heart. Internal assessments described the traps as a significant drain on manpower, not only through direct casualties, but through the psychological pressure they placed on every soldier moving through the field. Confirmed deaths from Punji stick injuries were recorded throughout the duration of the war. Napalm strike on Trang Bang. On June 8, 1972, a South Vietnamese Air Force aircraft dropped napalm on the village of Trang Bang, located approximately 25 miles northwest of Saigon along Route 1. A column of civilians had been sheltering in the area near the Quo Dai Temple. The strike was later officially described as a targeting error. Napalm is an incendiary compound that adheres to surfaces on contact and burns at temperatures documented at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Military records and journalistic accounts confirmed that the strike hit a section of road where civilians were present. Several people were killed immediately. Others sustained severe burn injuries across large portions of their bodies. A group of journalists and photographers were positioned on the road at the time of the strike. Associated Press photographer Nick Ut was among them. What he and other members of the press witnessed and documented placed the event into the public record in a way that few incidents of the war achieved. The civilian deaths from the strike were confirmed. The injured were transported for medical treatment. Several of those who sustained burns over significant portions of their bodies did not survive. The exact number of fatalities directly attributed to the strike varies across sources, but multiple civilian deaths were documented by journalists present and subsequently confirmed in official reporting. The South Vietnamese Air Force acknowledged the strike. Military investigators confirmed the aircraft, the munitions used, and the location. The incident was formally examined as a targeting error involving civilian casualties. Nick Utt's photograph from that day won the Pulitzer Prize the following year. It was entered into the official congressional record during debates about the war and is cited in historical documentation of the conflict's civilian toll. Firebase Mary Ann overrun. On the night of March 28, 1971, Firebase Mary Ann in Quang Tin Province, South Vietnam, was attacked by North Vietnamese Army sappers. The firebase was home to soldiers from the American Division's 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry. What happened over the following hours became one of the most examined single-night losses of American soldiers in the final years of the war. Sappers were specially trained infiltration units. They moved through perimeter defenses using wire cutters, demolition charges, and precise knowledge of defensive layouts. At Firebase Mary Ann, they breached the outer perimeter in the early morning hours while a significant portion of the garrison was asleep. Official military records confirm that security protocols that night fell well below required standards. Once inside the perimeter, the sappers moved through the firebase using explosives and small arms. Soldiers were killed in their bunkers and sleeping quarters before many had the chance to mount an organized defense. The attack lasted approximately 30 minutes. By the time it was over, 33 American soldiers were dead and 83 were wounded. The Army launched a formal investigation. The findings, later made public, documented specific failures in guard rotations, alert procedures, and command oversight on the night of the attack. The commanding officer of the battalion was reprimanded. Several other officers received administrative penalties. The investigation concluded that the scale of the losses was directly connected to the security failures identified. At the time, the United States was in the process of drawing down its forces in Vietnam under the Vietnamization policy, transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese units. Firebase Mary Ann became a focal point in congressional and military debates about whether that drawdown was proceeding too quickly and at what cost to the soldiers still stationed in the field. Ia Drang helicopter losses. In November 1965, the Ia Drang Valley in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam became the site of the first large-scale engagement between United States Army forces and the North Vietnamese Army. The battle would last several days and produce some of the heaviest American casualties of the entire war. It would also demonstrate, in confirmed and documented terms, exactly how vulnerable helicopter operations were in sustained ground combat. The U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division operated using airmobile tactics, meaning troops were inserted and extracted by helicopter rather than moving on foot or by vehicle. The Ia Drang Valley operation involved hundreds of helicopter flights. Military records confirm that multiple aircraft were shot down during the engagement. Helicopters attempting to land in or near active firefight zones drew concentrated ground fire. Some were hit on approach. Others were struck while hovering during troop insertions or casualty extractions. At Landing Zone Albany on November 17th, a column of American soldiers was ambushed by North Vietnamese forces at close range. The fighting was described in official Army historical accounts as some of the most intense of the war. 151 Americans were killed in the Ia Drang battles overall. Dozens of those deaths occurred during or in direct connection with helicopter operations, including downed crew members and soldiers killed during landings under fire. The Army conducted a detailed after-action review of the Ia Drang engagements. The findings shaped airmobile doctrine for the remainder of the war. Commanders noted that landing zones previously assessed as secure could become active combat zones within minutes, leaving aircraft and crews exposed with limited ability to maneuver. The 234 American soldiers confirmed killed across the full Ia Drang operation remain among the highest losses recorded in a single engagement of the Vietnam War. Agent Orange veteran deaths between 1961 and 1971, the United States military sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides across South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The program was called Operation Ranch Hand. Its stated purpose was to destroy vegetation that provided cover for enemy forces and to eliminate food supplies. The most widely used compound in the program was Agent Orange. Agent Orange contained dioxin, a chemical byproduct produced during the manufacturing process. At the time of spraying, the long-term effects of dioxin exposure on the human body were not publicly disclosed to the soldiers operating in affected areas or to the Vietnamese civilians living within them. Pilots flew low passes over jungle canopy and agricultural land. Ground troops moved through areas that had been sprayed days or weeks earlier. Skin contact and inhalation were documented exposure routes. Veterans began reporting serious health conditions in the years following the war. The conditions included multiple forms of cancer, nerve disorders, and organ disease. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs conducted reviews over several decades and formally recognized a list of illnesses as service-connected for veterans with confirmed exposure. Among the confirmed conditions were several cancers with documented fatal outcomes. In 1991, the Agent Orange Act formally directed the Department of Veterans Affairs to provide compensation to affected veterans. By the time the legislation passed, a significant number of veterans who had filed claims had already died from their conditions. The Department of Veterans Affairs estimated that millions of veterans carried potential exposure. The Vietnamese government separately documented widespread health effects among its civilian population in affected provinces. Independent researchers recorded elevated rates of certain cancers and conditions in regions with confirmed spray coverage. Deaths attributed to Agent Orange exposure were confirmed across decades, making it one of the longest-running documented casualty processes of the war. My Lai Civilian Massacre. On March 16, 1968, soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment of the United States Army entered the hamlet of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. They had been briefed that the area was a Viet Cong stronghold. When they arrived, they found no enemy combatants. What followed was documented in full by a subsequent military criminal investigation. Over the course of several hours, soldiers moved through the hamlet and killed unarmed civilians. The victims included women, children, and elderly residents. No armed resistance was recorded. Army photographer Ronald Haberle was present and documented the killings on camera. His photographs were later entered into the official record. The confirmed death toll, as established by the Army's own investigation, ranged between 347 and 504 civilians. The massacre was concealed by the chain of command for more than a year. It became public in November 1969 when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story, drawing on the accounts of soldiers who had been present. Haberle's photographs were published shortly afterward. The Army launched a formal investigation led by Lieutenant General William Pierce. The Pierce Commission report documented the killings in detail and identified a systematic cover-up extending through multiple levels of command. 26 officers and soldiers were charged with criminal offenses in connection with the killings or the subsequent concealment. Of those charged, only one was convicted. Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty of the premeditated killing of 22 civilians. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. That sentence was reduced on appeal and Calley was placed under house arrest. He was paroled in November 1974 after serving approximately 3.5 years. Last Americans at Koh Teng. On May 12, 1975, Cambodian Khmer Rouge forces seized the SS Mayaguez, an American cargo ship in the Gulf of Thailand. The crew of 39 was taken captive. President Gerald Ford ordered a military response. What followed became the final official military operation of the Vietnam War era, and it ended with American deaths that took years to formally confirm. On May 14th and 15th, United States Marines were dispatched to retake the ship and rescue the crew. The operation involved assaults on the Cambodian island of Koh Teng, where military planners believed the crew was being held. The crew had already been released before the assault began, a fact that was not confirmed until the operation was underway. The Marines on Koh Teng encountered heavily armed Khmer Rouge defenders. The fighting was intense. Helicopters came under fire during the initial landings. Several aircraft were damaged or destroyed. By the time the operation concluded, 41 American service members had been killed. The crew of the Mayaguez was recovered. But when the Marine forces withdrew from Koh Teng, 3 men were left behind. They were Private First Class Gary Hall, Lance Corporal Joseph Hargrove, and Private Danny Marshall. All 3 had been separated from the main force during the fighting. Their fate was not immediately known. All 3 were listed as missing in action. Subsequent investigations, including a classified Defense Intelligence Agency review, gathered evidence from Cambodian sources indicating that the 3 men had been captured and killed by Khmer Rouge forces after the American withdrawal. The exact circumstances of their deaths were not fully disclosed in public records. Gary Hall, Joseph Hargrove, and Danny Marshall were officially declared dead. They are documented as the last American military personnel killed in connection with the Vietnam War.